So, in today's episode of the Magical World of G. Michael Vasey podcast, my guest is Veda Austin, and she is a modern day alchemist in many respects, in that she is playing with water, as she puts it. But what she's actually doing is rather miraculous, and by freezing water and looking at the result, she's able to see the impact of consciousness upon water. And if you have not heard of her, I urge you to go to her website and look at some of the images and the thought that was put into the water before it turned into ice. We had a wonderful conversation. Here is that conversation with Veda Austin. Question. What on earth made you think about freezing water and looking at crystals?
That is a good question. I was curious because there were three people who inspired my work, and the secret always seemed to be in the freezing for them, where the unseen becomes seen. So most people have seen Emoto's work, although not embraced by the scientific community. Like, his work really made people see themselves as sensitive bodies of water, sensitive to thoughts and environment and music. And he was looking down the microscope at ice crystals that had been inspired by either a positive or a negative. So his work was very much in contrast. And so he saw beautiful ice crystals for a positive influence, and the ice kind of formed very unstructured designs for a more negative, I guess, if you want to say that, influence.
Yeah.
And but he didn't inspire me quite as much as another man by the name of Laurent Costa. And Laurent's not so well known, and he's become a friend over the years. But he was looking down the microscope, and he never wanted to experiment on water. And the reason for that was that he thought of water as his spiritual teacher, and he wanted to remain as much of the observer as he possibly could. And so he would just see what happened. He would sometimes smile at the water before he froze it. And he was not only seeing geometries like Emoto, but he was seeing imagery. He was seeing smiley faces. It was like the water was smiling back at him. He was seeing imagery of fish. He was seeing imagery of hearts. And all of these things were somehow relevant to something that had actually happened in his day, or that he'd been thinking about over a week. And I thought that was really, really extraordinary. And then Thomas Hieronymus, who I read about because I'm a researcher, and I read that he had gone into a Parisian meat market, and he was a radionic engineer. And he'd made this curious observation that when he looked at these freshly placed organs of an animal, and they somehow seemed to be affecting the way the frost froze on the glass behind where they were placed. For example, the liver organs seemed to be affecting the way the frost froze behind it because it was forming in the shape of a liver organ, and so on and so forth. And so he had this concept, or this hypothesis, that there seemed to be some kind of life force energy still emanating out of these organs, even though they weren't attached to an animal. And he put that down to be there being water in the blood, and that the water in the blood in these organs had sonic signatures, which help hold information for form and function. And that information was being shared with the water in the air, and the water in the air, as it hit the glass, froze into that form. And I thought that was really, really interesting, because he was seeing that with his naked eye. So all those years ago, 10 years ago, I was like, well, I want to see if water really has memory. Is it a real thing? And I didn't have a microscope, but I could see that even Rudolf Steiner suggested to his students, look at the way the frost freezes on a butcher's window compared to that of a florist's, and you'll see that they're different.
Did you really?
And so, yes, I did. And so I put all of that together, and I thought, well, I'm just going to put an influence into the water. I'm going to think something. I had some glass petri dishes from another project I was doing, and I had a freezer. So I thought, well, I'm just going to think something, and then I'm going to put that influenced water into the freezer and freeze it and see what happens. That was my very rudimentary idea. And so I was holding my dish of water, thinking about what I would think about, and I saw this little bit of fluff floating around in there. So I put my hand in to take out the fluff, and I noticed my hand, and I thought, oh, I wonder if my hand will have an impact on the water's memory. I thought, oh, that thought will do. I shoved it into the freezer, and I forgot about it. I came back to it hours later, and I held it up to the light, and I took my very, very first photo out of 45,000 photos now of water really responding in an incredibly intelligent manner. There was a very clear image of my hand. It looked like an X-ray of my hand, and it took half the petri dish, so it was macroscopically huge, and really freaked me out.
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting to see that at all.
Yeah.
Then I continued to do that for about a year, and I was seeing incredible imagery, about 1 in every 5 to 6. Sometimes it was 1 in 10 that I did, where I would see imagery relative to the influence. But about a year into it, I started to feel like I was missing something. And I became more familiar with the 4th phase of water, which I'm sure you're familiar with by Dr. Gerald Pollack, which was more of a, a plasma or a gel. So there's a liquid, solid, gas, and then this type of plasma or gel, which is the kind of water in our cells. And you find this type of water as water's beginning to freeze, but before it's frozen, and in the melting stage, but before it's a liquid.
Right.
So I thought, well, maybe if I start opening the freezer earlier and earlier, I'm going to see something different. I'm going to catch it in that stage.
Right.
So at about, 5 minutes, 20 seconds, there's a liquid on top, ice underneath. I take the sample out, I tip the liquid away, and I photograph the crystallography that's on the dish. And that's my technique that I've been teaching people around the world. Mm-hmm. And that is how it all began, really out of curiosity, like what would happen if.
Was it more of a scientific thing or more of a sort of spiritual thing that got you there in the first place?
I think we're all on a spiritual journey, whether we are studying science or economics or spirituality. But I like to have a threefold approach of things generally. I've always enjoyed science. I am a researcher. However, I also spent a good portion of my life working as a professional oil painter. So I have a lot of different facets, as we all do. So I do enjoy science. I love art. And I love all things to do with spirituality, with consciousness, with deeper understandings of the mysteries of life. So I think when you look at something from a genuine scientific perspective and share what you're actually seeing, and then you have an artistic approach, so you're seeing things from how something feels, perhaps the way something is in its living state as opposed to its dead state, which so many scientists look at dead tissue rather than living tissue, and I think we miss a lot. We miss the largest organ in the body, called the interstitium fluid, which is it's supposedly now an organ which moves water through all of the fascia. And then, of course, spirituality or consciousness, however you want to label that, that ties in with all indigenous wisdom, ancient wisdom. My father is Maori, so the Maori people of New Zealand have a great spiritual connection to water. So I call it weaving with water. I see that water weaves in all worlds.
So how consistent are the results, just out of interest?
Well, as soon as I could say that everything about my work is about relationship. So as my relationship developed with this fluid we call water, as I became more and more familiar with the fact that water is not what we think it is, and it's far deeper than we can imagine. And as I learned my technique, the imagery, to start with the art of water. So there's 3 ways that I've discovered that water communicates. There is art that most people are familiar with, as far as my work goes. Then there is the signature patterns of water. So, for example, rainwater looks like a fan with a slight curve. Municipal tap water tends to be disordered. Spring water forms hexagons, and filtered water is like a compacted lines. So that's a signature pattern. Mm-hmm. And then you have hydroglyphs, which is something very exciting, and that I'm speaking about at the next scientific conference at the annual water conference this year in Amsterdam. And that is essentially a identified symbol in ice that has to appear at least 50 times to say I have one, and I use a word influence. So I'll write a word, put my dish of water on top of it for 30 seconds, remove and freeze using my technique, and then photograph. And if that same symbol appears every time, not just occasionally, but every time, then I know I have one hydroglyph, and I have to have done that test at least 50 times.
Mm-hmm.
And if that symbol appears using a different word, what I've discovered is that there are layers of meanings which seem to be relative to the first word. They're somehow related. And so I'll have to do that test again. So I have 37 hydroglyphs right now. And we've discovered that if you write, obviously I speak English, so if you use the word creation and then you use the word creation from in another language, we'll see the same symbol. So it's interesting because it appears to be like a universal language. So that is a very, for me, and it's in the repeatability of it, it's quite remarkable. If I am like frustrated or annoyed about something and I somehow think it's a good idea to do crystallography, water won't play with me at all. I won't get anything. If I'm sad, water will design sad faces. It will ignore whatever I'm doing with it, but it will actually show me how it sees me. So the repeatability of art, for example, will it design art today? These days, it's like water reads my mind. These days, I just need to be thinking about something or feeling about something, because water appears to be more interested in what we're feeling than thinking, because it will often show you what you're feeling, and that overrides whatever your outward thinking is. Pretty much all the time. The only time water won't play with me now is if I am not in the right space. So, I recently shared on a podcast with another lady, with a lady, that she was like, well, does water always work, for you? Does it always design in this art, or does it always do one of these three things? And is that possible? So I shared some of this stuff with her, and she said to me, oh yeah, but can you trick it? And I was like, yeah, somebody asked me once if I could trick water. And this was years ago, and I would never do this now. So I just kind of said to the water, I know that sounds kind of crazy, but there's nothing stopping me from doing anything. And I said, and I felt it, if you show me something really special, show me something phenomenal, just between me and you, just let's do that. And so I froze the water, but my intention was that I would share it on social media. So I was literally lying, and I felt really guilty as well.
Right.
And so that there was that going on, and it was kind of confronting in a way, because the imagery in the ice was disordered, but there were two letters that appeared, and the letters were NO. And so it was like, oh my God, I'm never going to do that again, because that was such a wake-up call. And I was like, what am I working with here? And I cannot play around with this. This is serious stuff. And it will not allow me to work in the mode of, in a dishonest kind of way. It won't work for me. It won't play with me. And it's clearly telling me in letters that I understand what it will and won't do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I had never actually come across your work or yourself until relatively recently, when one of the guys on Facebook that I interact with around dowsing asked me if I'd contact you to see if you'd talk to me, and kindly enough you did. And funnily enough, after that moment, everywhere I go right now, you're there. So I think just recently you did a podcast with an astrologer lady that I'd done a podcast with and follow. You're on Facebook at the moment because you're in the UK soon, talking somewhere, I think. And everywhere, it's almost like as soon as I found out about you, you're everywhere, which is bizarre. But the reason why I'm really intrigued is because I'm a dowser of earth energies. I'm a geologist originally, but I dowse earth energies, and I'm also a trained magician. And I'm just stunned by the parallels that you're experiencing working with water that I have working with earth energies, and what it seems to suggest to me about consciousness and spirituality. So just as an example, if I'm looking for an earth energy line, and I've tried to project it sort of with my conscious mind where it's going to go, and then I can't find it, and I'm driving around in the car, I dowse in the car, driving around in the car and I can't find it, and then I'll pull over to consult my map and have a think. And usually what happens is I find that where I stop to pull over is where the line is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can talk for hours about this. In fact, I often do. But I've come to the conclusion that subconsciously, I already know where all of these energy lines are. And the dowsing is simply bringing it to the attention of my consciousness, right? And I've come to the conclusion that these earth energy lines, I call it the web of weird, are some kind of an spiritual infrastructure. I mean, they also tend to talk to you about your past, your present, your future, that you have an intimate connection with them. When I looked at your website and some of the videos, I started to spot some parallels. Yeah, it's the message coming through suggests that we're not. Science isn't doing us any favors. It's not looking in the right direction. There's a lot of they call it woo-woo and spirituality and stuff like this. And I am a PhD scientist, so I know exactly where they're coming from. But there's something going on that people are experiencing in terms of the nature of the world we live in that's absolutely stunning and amazing, don't you think? And I just wonder, what do you when you have these experiments with water and you come across these amazing synchronicities and amazing experiences, what are you thinking about the nature of consciousness? What is it making you suspect? What is your hypothesis about the nature of our reality?
That's a massive question.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think things are staring us right in the face. They're just hidden in plain sight. That's one of the things about water, is that we often forget that there's water in the air. The secrets are in the subtleties. Often people ask me, is water conscious, or is our consciousness impacting the water? The more I've worked with water, the more I would ever, in the beginning, with knowing very little, and I still feel like I hardly know anything. And in my personal experience, I think in the beginning of my work, I would have thought that maybe our consciousness is impacting the water. But now I've come to see more and more and more things that some people might just think are absolutely crazy, but they're real. And I've come to wonder, is water part of the giant web of consciousness?
Mm-hmm.
This is interesting because there is a few people that suggest that hydrogen is the spirit of water, and that plasma is the mind or brain of water, and that water itself, that the liquid water that we see, is the body that houses the spirit of water. And that's very interesting, because you look at hydrogen, and hydrogen is like absolutely everywhere. You look at the sun is this great big giant burning ball of hydrogen.
Mm-hmm.
And the evaporation literally of water is like the source pulling the water back home. And so the more I look into water, and I've done this thing where I thought, well, how can I be the observer of water only? How can I observe it? Because my idea, and this has come about after many years of observation and deep thought, it comes from an indigenous word. So in the Maori culture, the word for spirit is wairua. It means two waters. It's a very rudimentary way of saying this, but the physical and spiritual waters. And that's very interesting to me, that there would be two. And they also make sense to me because we have a physical body, obviously, and there is a spiritual aspect to it, a spirit that houses the body.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also fluid water that flows through us. So I've always thought that the more spiritual aspect of water is the observer, never in judgment. And I've also seen that water improves things. So, for example, if imagine there's a second glass here, and I have spring water and tap water, and I leave them side by side overnight. If I have a water that helped heal me, and it was a 9.9 pH spring water, and so with this particular test, I had some of that water in a glass, and I had just tap water in a glass, and its pH was 7.3, I believe. So I tested the pH after they'd been sitting beside each other overnight, not touching, and the The spring water stayed the same, but the tap water's pH had improved, had gone up by nearly two points. That's a lot.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
so the crystallography of the tap water had also improved. So rather than seeing disordered patterns, I'd started to see ferns, and I'd started to see a few small hexagons appear. So it had crystallographically improved, but interestingly, even the crystallography of the spring water improved. So it was almost like it had a purpose. And I found that really interesting because that has been quite a consistent thing. And so then I thought, well, if water's the observer, how can I witness this without being the observer? So I started doing studies whilst dreaming, because I thought, well, at least I'm not in my awake conscious state.
Right.
I'm in more of a subconscious. So I would put a petri dish of water beside my bed with the intention that it capture some part of my dream. And I sleep in the dark. So this was all happening in a dark room. And in the morning, I'm sure you know this, but when you have a dream and in the morning you wake up and you kind of just grasping at it because it's just starting to go away.
Yeah.
When I woke up and that happened and I knew I dreamt, but I'd forgotten, those were the ones that I would freeze. And when I would freeze them, what was amazing was that I would see imagery so clear in there that it would literally jog my memory of the dream enough for me to actually be able to write the whole dream out. For example, I had a dream that I was in this like yacht boat thing, and the waves went on forever, and I was feeling really seasick, and then finally it stopped, but the waves were really big, and in the ice was this very clear picture of what looked like a ship and these big waves. And I did a whole study on the dreams. So how is it then that how can water accompany me on my dreams, in my dream state? How is that possible when I am not in my normal state? I don't know what I'm going to dream. We never seem to. And so I was like, well, how is that possible unless water can be in different states and different worlds, is intimately connected with us? And not by volume, and I'm sure you know this, but by molecular count, we're 99% water. Yeah. And our eye lens says 99% water. That means we see the entire world through the lens of water. And people often say things like, the eyes are the windows to the soul. And it's interesting, this idea of the retina of the eye. I don't know if you have heard me talk much about that, but there's a lot of very interesting things about the retina of the eye. And of course, that is made up of quite a large proportion of water. But even the ancient Egyptians, they understood very well the anatomy of the body and its spiritual purposes as well as its physical. And my friend Venice, who was one of the directors of a series called Magical Egypt, was telling us that there is quite a lot of DMT within the eye, of the retina of the eye, and the Egyptians knew this, and they believed that it actually helped our perception of the world, of what we see, which was quite interesting because our intelligent fluid body and our physical body is designed in such a way that in some of our times of deepest sorrow, we have these incredible tears that come out. It's like they just get pushed out of our eyes, and then our face is designed in a certain way where those tears will roll back towards our mouth, redesigned and restructured to become like a medicine to help heal our hearts. And so we have this incredible fluid system, but then, like, what is this water? What are we working with? And do we really know ourselves? It's interesting because when we learn about the human body, we learn about all the functions of the body and what all the organs do and this. But if you pardon the pun, you boil it down, we're water, salts, minerals, and consciousness. Yeah. And that's interesting because water and salt have this incredible synergy. See, I don't use distilled water for my work.
I was going to ask you about salt. It's on my question list.
Yeah, salt's a big one. So I don't use distilled water because although distilled water has a signature pattern when you freeze it, so some people will say, oh yeah, but it's got this pattern. Well, yeah, every water has a pattern when you freeze it in the specific short-term crystallography. but I've never seen art designed in distilled water. And I think it's because it lacks those salts and minerals. It's more of an observer. That's how I see distilled water. Which is quite different, because people that do homeopathy, and I've done a small study anyway on homeopathy, where I've put a drop or two of the remedy into spring water, and seen that the design will often reflect the plant that the original essence was made of, and it doesn't do that in distilled water. So I kind of wanted to, I think of spring water and seawater and waters with salts and minerals to be more like us.
Yeah.
It's kind of like distilled water observes only, but river water or stream water or any of these waters that have a mix of salt and water, then they have the ability to be the observer, but also to be able to hold and store memories. So we're like an ocean, and we are able to observe ourselves, as many people who have had near-death experiences have that sense of rising, looking down upon their bodies and having no attachment to it.
Mm-hmm.
People that have had out-of-body experiences from psychedelics, from various different meditations, they can observe themselves. And even in dreams, sometimes we're observing a sense of ourself moving around. But how do we do that?
Well, water is very interesting because in the world I come from, magical world, studying Kabbalah and the Tree of Life and things like this, of course, you have Bina, which is the top of the feminine pillar, which is often referred to as the bitter sea, the bitter ocean, i.e. the saline waters of consciousness. And so from a magical perspective, water really does represent, to me anyway, consciousness, and the salinity of it has significance as well within a magical context. And one of the things that I did was I got obsessed with the hexagram, and you mentioned hexagon. And I got into looking at the four elements and using the hexagram as a key to unlock more information from other magical systems like Kabbalah, Tree of Life, astrology, etc. And I looked specifically at the water triangle and what it connects. And I came up with three polarities: horizontal, vertical, and in-out polarity. And the polarity that goes down goes from spiritual to physical. It's the polarity, it's how things are created. So it's the concept picked up in the framework, which is Yesod, which is the framework behind reality, and then made into reality, made into substance in Malkut, right? And again, Yesod is thought of as watery, as the waters of consciousness, right? And that's where creation takes place on the mental level. So when you're working with water in the way that you are, you're really echoing this concept of creation, how creation occurs in magic, right? You're using your mental processes to communicate to this water and then turning that into a solid or a near solid. So you're actually creating your thoughts in that conscious substrata of water. And when I looked at this water pyramid in particular, it really struck me that salt plays a critical role. And if you look at alchemy, they had these three principles, and salt was one of the principles. And when you put that into the hexagram work that I did, it is that principle of creation from spiritual to physical. I know I'm waffling on a bit, and you'd have to probably look at the book, but it just, the parallels with dowsing, parallels with magic, the parallels, it just like, my God, I had so many questions. I don't think we're ever going to have enough time, you know.
but salt's so interesting because salt is a crystal, and crystals store information. Yeah. And so what's interesting about it is when you put salt and water together, they have this incredible synergy where water becomes like a literal liquid crystal. Yeah. It has this electrical component all of a sudden, and it's kind of takes on a life of its own. And that's very interesting to me. And you talk about my process. So there's water freezes in 3 stages. The first stage is where there's liquid on top and ice underneath, and you tip the liquid away, and that's the process. But the second stage is where there's 2 slabs of ice. It's like an ice sandwich with liquid in the middle. And then the last stage is when it's a solid. And so I think of it like the liquid crystal stage where I take the water and I tip the liquid away and I photograph it, I think of that like spirit. The next stage where it's like an ice sandwich, I think of it like blood. And then the solid stage, I think of it like body. Body encompasses the blood and the spirit, but you're actually getting to see in this in-between stages. Like I said, the secrets are in the subtleties. I know you know that. So it's a very, very special stage. It's also the stage where all of these salts and minerals are actually pushed away. It's creating fourth phase water. Fourth phase water pushes out solates, which is why it's called exclusion zone. So it has a negative charge. It absorbs more light. And I don't want to forget to talk about light. And so this woman, she said to me years ago, she said that she could speak to bees. I mean, I speak to water, so, you know, nothing surprises me anymore. And she said that she would watch their hives for long periods of time. And one day a bee kind of somehow came out and communicated and said, we don't mind you looking at our hive, but don't look at it for so long because your conscious expression is putting too much light in the hive and we like it to be darker. Huh. So where we put our conscious expression is also where we put our light. Now, water is a huge proportion of photons. Water is the storer of light, is the light bearer, if you will. And what I've been able to see in my freezer over these many years, if I get it at the perfect time, I open, and I'm just using my regular household freezer. If I open the freezer, just as the water's starting to freeze, it makes these little ice shoots. I can photograph light coming out of those shoots, and sometimes I can see it. So I actually think that it's light that paves the way for the design of the ice. So there's this incredible freedom that fluid water has, that when it is not encased in a body.
Again, this goes back to sort of elemental magical principles and Kabbalah. So the masculine force is force, and the female side is basically form. Mm-hmm. And in the tree of life, you have to go down through the male across to the female. So it's the force into form, and that sets off creation. So light is the solar male principle, and water is the female principle. And so you're doing alchemy, you're doing modern alchemy. And I'm beginning
to realize that you're right. You know, I've been going along and people ask me like, how did you come up with this idea? But, you know, it's just, I go with, well, I have inspired thought a lot. And inspired thought's not the kind of thought that regurgitate around every day. Mm-hmm. It's something that just comes to you at, 3 o'clock in the morning or something, or in the shower often is for me. And I'm like, oh, I have to pursue that. That feels like a good idea. And I just think, oh, why don't I just try this?
Yeah. And that's how it works, I think. And that's how I call it the management. But that's how management works. It communicates with you at the strangest of times. I was also going to say that I've done some work with water from a magical. I've often tried to imagine living a totally magical life, so that everything you do is consciously magical. Of course, it lasts 30 seconds and then I'm distracted, unfortunately, because I'm just human. But one example is when drinking any fluid, to basically think into the fluid, the quality or whatever it is you want to take on board. And so I use water to take on board properties. I also use water in the shower. I imagine that the shower is washing away the qualities or characteristics of myself that I no longer want or need. And these are very powerful, suggestive techniques, but they actively use this water idea, right? So, as I said, when I started looking at your website, I got very excited because I could see all these things came together, in ways that I'm like, wow. Especially with dowsing and some of this weekend I went dowsing, and I've told this story to a friend last night. I was looking for a specific line. I wanted to follow it. And it was in an area that was on the edge of where I live, Brno, into a forest with a Celtic hill fort in the forest. And I wasn't quite sure which one of these narrow lanes went all the way to where I wanted to park. So I'm going down this narrow lane. I'm thinking, okay, I better pull over and have a look at my map online. So I pull over at these garages and I look at the map. And I realize I'm on the right road. I drive another couple of 100 meters to the end of the road where you have to park the car and go on foot. And I park the car and off I went. And I found the line and mapped it. I found the hill fort. The lines went through it. I came all the way around the back so that I'm coming into the road that I drove in. And as I'm going along, I know I'm going to hit the line again because it just has to come in that way. Guess where I found it? I found the female line at the garages where I stopped to consult the map, and the male line at the place I parked my car. I mean, how does that happen?
Well, I smile because the more we get out of our own way, the clearer things become. And we do actually have answers within us. We have this like internal compass.
Yeah, absolutely.
Internal compass is like it always works. We just have to get out of this mental state so much that we are often in. I absolutely love the dowsing community. I'm staying with the Devon Dowsers, and they are very near and dear to my heart. And when I was living out in Langs Beach a couple of years ago, I was out on a property, big, beautiful farm, with lots of native trees. And I was with a beautiful friend of mine who's sadly passed away. And I was talking about about dowsing. We were talking about it. And as we were walking, it was just grass. And as we were walking right in front of it, just as I was talking about dowsing, there was this perfect tree stick, which was like in the dows, in the form of the dowsing rod. And my friend, she picked it up and she said, "Oh my God, it's a dowsing rod." And I'm like, "Oh my goodness, it is too." And then my daughter came running down. She said, "Oh, Mum, I can't find," she had this pretty little necklace and it had come off. She said, "I can't find it." And I said, "Well, this is a great time for you to start learning how to douse, darling." So I gave her this little stick and she says, "What do I do with it?" I said, "Well, you hold on to it and you just feel where it's taking you." Yeah. And so off she went and down and anyway, and then she says, "Oh, this feels like a good spot." And so we're kind of looking around and everything, and I can't see anything. And my friend's looking, can't see anything. And she's like, "Oh, it doesn't work." And I'm like, "Well, you don't know." And then anyway, I said, "Oh, just move over, honey. We'll just have a look at it." And she was standing on it. She was actually putting a foot on it.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, "Oh my goodness, there's definitely something there." And I've played with dowsing myself, but I realized for me personally that I have an internal dowsing system. And I think it's where your intuition just tells you where to go. Like you feel it. And if we're salt, and minerals, water, and consciousness, then why shouldn't we be able to communicate with the water lines, the holy lines, the sacred lines? That this planet is a water planet too.
I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, and you've just reminded me of one of them, which is I know that you take students and teach them the method that you use. And one of the things that I've noticed with dowsing and anything related to these kind of topics is if the person doesn't believe, they don't get results. Do you find the same thing with what you do with students?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have thousands of people that have learned how to do this work now. It's interesting. Like I said, there's 3 ways that water will communicate. It will tell you about itself, which means it'll show you a signature pattern. It will design artistically, or it will show you some of these glyphs that I talked about. Everyone will see one of those. The people that see the most art are the people that are the most open. So the people that are most skeptical will often see a signature pattern. Sometimes they see hydroglyphs. These seem to be a way in which water naturally occurs, not so much the hydroglyphs, but the signature patterns. So even when people start learning this technique, they can still, skeptical or not, they're still actually going to see one of those 3. And that's very encouraging, I feel, because I've studied the patterns for so long. What I've started to get very familiar with is the way in which they all stem from the hexagon. So the hexagon is the blueprint of water. And so the longer water, especially freshly collected spring water, for example, or artisan water that's come out of the earth, the earth, it's like a womb, and it has this relationship with the water. The water's like all of its kind of veins and arteries. And where you come into the thermal water within the earth, that they're like organs. They're like the organs of the planet. And they have different functions, a certain type of organ. And the earth has lots of organs, but the thermal hot springs, that's a very important organ for the planet. And so you kind of have this idea, okay, well, there's this water going through the earth, and it's having this relationship with our planet, and it comes out, and it will form a hexagon, and the larger the hexagon in the crystallography, the healthier, and I use that word not specific to drinking, but specific to the energetic state of water. So what are we seeing in this crystallography? I think it's really important to ask that question. What are we looking at here? And what I've identified by using tap water a lot is that municipal tap water, for the most part, creates this very disordered pattern. So I always say, get to know the signature patterns of your water when you begin this work. Don't launch into it expecting water to do what you want. Mm-hmm. This is a relationship. I'm not going to meet somebody and expect them to just do whatever I want immediate or ever, really. That's not the relationship of love. Water is teaching you about a healthy, loving relationship because it gives so much. But you also need to get out of your own way. So it will not play with me, like I said, if I'm not in a good, right relationship with it. And so when I use tap water as if you want to use the more scientific word, if you want to use that as a control, and then you let that tap water melt after you've done the crystallography, so it's the same water, and then you hold that liquid water to your heart for a minute in a loving expression, and then you refreeze it, that water goes from disordered to coherent. You'll start to see, those fern shapes or more little hexagons, but it's not changing chemically. So what we're seeing is a structural change, not a chemical change. And that means that it's almost like water is showing you an emotional expression.
Mm-hmm. And water, again, magical principles, represents emotion. So, yeah. I mean, it all fits. The final question that I have, because we're getting close to time, is some of the work that I've been doing with Earth energy lines has led me to the conclusion that frequency, sound frequency, has a massive impact on consciousness. And for example, if you come to a node, often there'll be a church built over the node, and they'll use sacred architecture to accentuate the energies. But if you go in and play certain frequencies, solfeggio frequencies mainly, that amps the pressure up even more. Have you done any work looking at how water responds to frequencies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've done lots of work with sound, with frequency, and with music. So I've used different frequencies so far as the big crystal singing bowls with various different tones of the singing bowl. People have sent me frequencies that they have said are harmonizing, and I've seen how water responds to them. It's interesting with the singing bowls because they're set at a certain frequency. And some of them are off. So if you actually have a good musician and you have a singing bowl, not most of the time, I won't say that, but quite often the tone is actually not right. But when you put water into the singing bowl, you can actually, and then you play it, you can get that tone to be the perfect tone. Mm-hmm. And when you freeze that water, it will give you a specific pattern. So certain frequencies show a certain pattern. And when you repeat it, you see the same pattern. So we're starting to see that there are symbols for sound in water. So in a similar way to cymatics, we're seeing it in real time, but we're also seeing symbols within this crystallography that are relative to sound. But sometimes water don't do what you expect. For example, I'll see a spiral kind of a shape fairly consistently for the sound of Om. But when I just thought, in my arrogance, I assumed that water, using the sound of a gong, when I used the sound of a gong, that the water might design something similar, because to me, there are some similarities in the sound. But because I just assumed that water would do that, it designed the instrument instead. It designed the gong with a mallet on top. So it completely ignored me as far as me thinking that it would do some similar design, and it did something else. So it's interesting. As long as I stay out of my arrogance or like assumptions,
Yeah,
and just curious what it will play with me. And I guess that's a similar way with dowsing. If we stay
absolutely,
out
absolutely.
of your
I
head.
recognize exactly what you're saying because I now douse. I'll be talking. I can just douse talking to someone. I just have the rod. So long as I'm not in the way, the rod will react. But if
Yeah.
I try, and this is what people do wrong when they first start trying to douse, that they're too focused on trying something is going to happen. What's going to happen? Nah, just forget that you've got the dowsing rods in your hand. Do some, look at the scenery, think something, and everything will take care of itself. That's what I find.
It's the key, because we get very attached to outcomes.
Yeah.
And actually, it's like we're always learning something. So I think about, what is my relationship with whatever it is. So if I'm looking for like a Mary line or something like that, it's like, well, what is my relationship with the earth that I'm walking on? If you think, sometimes I think about it, I'm a very visual person. So sometimes, we take for granted we're walking along the ground, and say we're walking along the earth or the grass. But underneath us, there's so much going on.
Oh yeah.
Like, you don't think about it. So I think about that, and I imagine, okay, so if here's me at the top and my feet are on the ground, here are my feet, and then underneath here it's kind of the in between. It's kind of like the sand, right? So if you imagine, here is the sea, there is the sand, and here is the shore, like the rest of the ground. So the sand's the in between. So I think of the earth as a little bit of the in between. So here's my feet, here's the in between, and underneath that, I sometimes imagine that there's another me upside down.
Uh-huh.
And so as I'm walking along, it's like looking at yourself in a puddle. And the me in the ground has a very, very good view of everything inside the earth. I have a connection with it. And so I'm able to kind of just watch that me. So it takes me out of my head. So I'm focused already on being inside of the earth. And that gives me a lot of more focus on something different than the outcome of where I'm going. So I'm watching
Mhm.
where I'm taking me. And that way, it's like you also feel how close to something special you are, how close to a reflection of yourself you are, how close to the earth you are. And then you start to feel it. It's almost like that layer in between becomes thinner and thinner and thinner. And then you get a sense of this oneness
Mhm.
and that pure reflection. And you feel, oh, actually now all that earth energy is coming up through me and filling
Yeah.
up this part, and then this part can be start going down.
I had one of those once in a lifetime type experiences quite recently where I was investigating a really massive node vortex at a place called Svarty Hostin here in Czech Republic. It's on a hill. It's got natural springs, and it's a site of veneration for the Catholics and also for the pagans. They have an imagery of Mary with baby Jesus, which I interpret as the goddess Merkosh with Perun, the sky god. Because it's all there when you look at it. It's a different story. So because the vortex was so strong, and because the guy was practicing organ in the church facility that on the top of the hill, there was no tourists in there, which is highly unusual. The organ sound was so loud and abrasive, nobody wanted to be in there. So I went in and I stood in the vortex, and I just basically stood like a cross myself, and I started to meditate. And I thought, oh, I'll use a technique of pore breathing, taught by a Czech magician called František Barden. And basically what you do is, as you breathe, you imagine that you're also breathing through your skin, through your pores, and breathing out through the pores. So it's entire body breathing. So I start breathing this in, and literally within 2 breaths, I had to grab out for something because I was floating. I was floating off, and I grabbed out, lost my balance, almost fell over. I mean, it would have looked comical to anybody looking on. But in that moment of floating away, I just knew everything was one thing. I felt everything all at once going on everywhere. And that was the moment for me when I realized that, and I'm getting chills even now talking about it. That was the moment when I realized that, we need to continue dowsing and looking at water and all of these things, because that's where the answers are. It's not in deconstruction science, taking things apart, putting them back together again. It's in how the mind and the consciousness interacts with And I just came to the conclusion everything's one thing. We're all just aspects of the one thing experiencing different things. And it just blew me away. You can't really explain. I'm sure you understand.
Oh, I do understand. And it is interesting because I think of water as source rather than a resource. And water in not just as a liquid, but I think there are many, many different levels and layers and subtleties within each aspect of water. And the water in the air as well, that's a way in which, and this would be a whole nother talk, but
Water in the
I think
breath, it's everywhere.
water, we have electrical charge, and water in the air is attracted to that. So it gives us this web of information that it receives and also gives out about ourselves. So it's rather than like, when you meet someone and you feel like you've always known them, or sometimes you meet someone and there's this disconnect immediately. Well, often that's that web that's around us, which looks, if you imagine, I tend to like to think of it like, if you imagine a spider web with lots of dew on it. I mean, it's just an example to give a visual, but if you imagine that the very minute particles of water within the air are attracted to this charge all around us, and it looks a bit like a giant spider web, like a liquid antenna. So your patterns move with your emotions and everything, but when you meet someone and the patterns are very, very similar, there is an immediate remembering, immediate liking. And when they're very different, there is often an immediate
Yes.
And so when we feel the energy in the air, we can feel heavy energy because it lasts longer, it's denser. So we feel that. So it's like literally we're using this liquid antenna to feel the energies, and that's communicating to us through our intuition, and our intuition is the water within us. And that's what is part of that internal compass guiding us along the way.
Absolutely
And
agree.
we know that our intuition is right, because when we don't listen to it, we always wish we had.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking at the clock, and there is one last question that I should ask, which is you're looking at these symbols, these hieroglyphs, and a sort of a language of water. Is that sort of taking you in a particular direction? Are you discovering something there that I haven't asked, in a sense, that would be interesting to discuss here?
Maybe. I think that hydroglyphs, and they do have an overlay with hieroglyphs, and that they are conceptual, so that they're telling a concept. So rather than saying, because water doesn't read words, it absorbs the energy of words and crystallizes into a form that presents the energy of that word. So rather than saying, here's my glass, I would say, well, here's the energy of my glass. It's a very different thing. So what we've seen, and what I've seen around the world now, with other people doing this work, is that these hydroglyphs literally are symbols. They are recognizable, they are repeatable, and they have vast amounts of information. So when I asked water, what's a hydroglyph, in relation to what, I'm not the only person that's ever used that word before. So it's just what I've kind of called them. And they know water knows what I mean. So it gave me two symbols, the living glyph, and which is and the message glyph. So they are living messages. And I think that's very profound. And so what I'm starting to see is I can ask questions and get viable answers. What's even more wonderful. And I often can't even talk about this without feeling emotional, but this one lady, she reached out to me, and her child is very severely disabled and can't write and can't communicate, can't speak, but can make sounds. And she's never really been able to know if her child even understands her saying, I love you. So she recorded some of her daughter's sounds and sent me the recordings. And the first one was after she had told her daughter that she loved her and she cared about her, and that what she was actually doing.
Yeah.
And so in the water were very, very clearly defined hydroglyphs, of which I am only just touching the surface of the depth of what they mean. But there was a message there which was so clearly for that lady from the daughter. And I relayed that message, and we were on FaceTime together. And I met the daughter, and she said, this is what it said you said. This is what, did you say this? And the little girl was like clapping her hands, and it was just like, oh my, she felt seen, she felt heard in a world where no one hears her, even her parents could not understand. And she
Wow.
was able to share that she not only received that information, but that she also loved her mum,
Wow.
and how grateful she was. And there is a hydroglyph for grateful. There is a hydroglyph for love. You know, there are these ways, and they're so much deeper than we think. So I think that the more we study about hydroglyphs, the more we're starting to get into learning about understanding symbols in a way in which I think our very, very old ancestors did. The
Yeah.
future is
Mhm.
ancient.
Yeah, absolutely agree. It's a good place to, with that, it's a good place to wrap it up. If people watching, listening, want to find out more about you and your work, where can they go?
Sure. My website's very unoriginal. It's just my name, vedaustin.com. Instagram is Veda_Austin_water. And I think you can get all those links on my website anyway. Facebook is Veda Austin @Water Researcher.
Well, it's been wonderful. Thank you very much for taking the time out.
It's my pleasure. It's lovely to meet you.